Roadhouse, the most recent addition to the Prime Video catalog, is a remake or a reimagining of the 1989 cult classic starring Patrick Swayze, this one featuring Jake Gyllenhaal as a washed-up/disgraced former UFC fighter with a checkered past who rolls into a town, in this case in the Florida Keys, to help save a roadhouse from some thugs and villains and, do the action hero thing, bringing swift justice with his fists and wit. So, how well does the story work? Does the movie succeed at what it tries to be? Is it worth watching? We're going to dig into all of that and more in this deep dive story analysis of Roadhouse. As we dive in here, I think it's important to start by saying that I am a firm believer in evaluating a story based on how well it succeeds at doing what it is attempting to do, not based on how well I subjectively like what it's trying to do. Because everyone has different preferences. Everyone has different genres they prefer or don't prefer. Everyone has different tropes or characterization elements. Like, we all as audiences prefer certain things. So when I do a review, I try not to say it was good or bad. What I try to help you think about is like, how well does it do what it is trying to do? So then you have a better handle on A, whether you want to watch it or read it, because you'll then know whether it's the kind of story you'd be interested in, and B, because I think that's a more effective way to learn about storytelling. So what is Roadhouse trying to do? Well, it's an action story, obviously, but specifically it falls under the subgenre of a Western, which you might be surprised. You're like, I don't see any cowboy hats, there's no, horse rides or shootouts, and that's true, but the structure of a typical classical Western, this story really follows that closely, and actually they have one of the secondary characters explicitly call that out fairly early on in the story. Like, she tells Jake Gyllenhaal's character, oh, you're like a character in a Western. You're, riding in to dispense justice and put the town to rights. She just says it, which in the moment is actually it's funny and it works for her character, but it's also very on the nose. Yes, that is exactly what this story is trying to be. And we'll talk a little bit later about how well it succeeds at fulfilling some of the expectations of that genre, since that's what they set themselves up to be right at the beginning, but that's what it's trying to do. So the action genre as a whole is largely focused on agency and sort of moral valor through physical means, and kind of questions of when violence is justified in pursuit of good ends. And a lot of times it kind of gets at that sub-feeling that a lot of us live with of the world is often out of sorts or wrong, and I think it's a very human thing to wish that we could just solve the problem, go do something about it. And really that's what the action genre largely boils down to. It's a person who's gonna go do something about it, whatever that is, in a much more direct way. In a lot of ways, it as a genre, it kind of serves as a contrast to either a legal thriller or a police procedural or something like that, which has a similar setup of something is wrong or something is being threatened. But in those cases, the hero uses societal means or legal means to solve the problem. In the action genre, the hero kind of goes outside societal or legal means to use physical violence or capability or skill to solve the problem. And the Western kind of falls in this interesting hybrid space as a genre, because it is typically broadly an action story in that sense that it's a genre that is concerned with the role of the individual in sort of taking morality and ethics into their own hands to go do the right thing or solve problems, again, often through sort of violence or more direct means. But as a genre, it is also heavily concerned with the intersection between personal agency and sort of societal norms or laws. A lot of times those stories take place in settings that technically are under the auspices of a legal system. Maybe there's a sheriff, or there's, the law in a broad sense, but it's enough on the borders or out in, in the countryside or whatever that justice is being subverted and powerful people can get away with twisting the law to their own ends or ignoring it entirely, which is why you kind of need a hero. But there's often, in a good Western, there's sort of this tension between the idea that the hero is doing things that maybe aren't all that different from the things that the villains are doing. In the best cases, that raises interesting story questions to explore. So let's dive into talking about the positives first. I think that's a nice way to start. A couple things I really liked about the storytelling and the core story of Roadhouse. First is the character of Dalton that Jake Gyllenhaal plays, I think is very effective. And having a good protagonist goes a long way towards creating a good story. He's interesting and unusual in the way that he sort of subverts common action hero norms, primarily through his personality and dialogue that he is given. He is actually weirdly polite, very restrained, kind, thoughtful. He's a lot of the things that you don't necessarily get in a typical action hero, especially just like a fighting folk. Like, he is a fighter. That's his career. And so it's interesting. You get these, especially early on, we're given little moments where we're given windows into his character and essentially the way he interacts with other people. And having that kind of character pop, where there's this distinctive thing about this character that you understand immediately, that you go, oh, and oftentimes that can be done as a contrast to the audience's normal expectations of what you think you're going to get, and then those expectations are subverted in a surprising way. Like, that can be really effective, and they do that well here, both in the script and then also just Jake Gyllenhaal's acting of the character is fantastic. He has so much charisma. He obviously worked super hard for the role to turn into Jack Gyllenhaal hardcore. Like, that is impressive. So that's acting stuff. That's not really like story analysis, but you need the actor to be able to deliver on what is embedded in the script, and I do think he did a great job with that. And they do, I think, an effective enough job of doling out his backstory in snippets. He has some like dreams along the way that are actually done as sort of flashbacks to this sort of pivotal thing that happened for him in his fighting career that kind of pulled him out of the UFC, and apparently are his thing that he's racked with guilt about. But the thing that I didn't love is that the twist, if you will, in his backstory is exactly what you think it is right from the beginning. It's like, oh, I bet it's that. Yep, it was that. But they try to treat it like this mystery they're unspooling, and they don't show you what he's so upset about, but like, it's exactly what you think it is. So it's a little bit like, well, why did you spend so much time acting like it was this big mystery like we all knew? So that was whatever, but they do give him, that twist, that kind of tortured hero backstory where he has a thing he's running from in his past, or that he feels he's racked with guilt about, that he needs to deal with. And that sets up sort of one of the central themes of the story, which is this idea that violence is good if it's used for the right reasons. And that's a very common theme in action in general, that sort of, even though we all, in a broad sense, say violence isn't the answer, the action genre is the one that kind of says, well, sometimes it is. Even metaphorically, what we watch on the screen might be physical violence, but often thematically and narratively, that can stand in as sort of a metaphorical shorthand for being direct and taking risks and like facing a problem head on and dealing with it. But the central argument of this story is that core thrust. Here you have a guy who is extremely good at fighting, who at the beginning of the story is very directionless and almost tries to commit suicide at the very beginning of the movie, because he has so little sense of value in himself. And the ideal thematic arc of the story is that he discovers the value in who he is and what he's good at in service to like a higher ideal, right? That's the setup. We'll talk a little bit more in the negatives about some of the ways where maybe that theme wasn't paid off as well as it could have been. But broadly speaking, it's fine. It's not breaking any new ground. But again, I don't think this story is trying to break any new ground. Like, it is, from the jump, it is a fairly straightforward, and in some ways, it's sort of a throwback to a more classic style, which works because this is a remake of an older, more archetypal, like 1989 was a certain type of action story. So the fact that this version of Roadhouse isn't really trying to be particularly nuanced or original in its approach to its action story, because it's a remake of a classic movie, worked a little bit better for me stylistically than it would have if it was just some movie where it's like, wow, that was very vanilla and on the nose. But like, yeah, because they're remaking an older one. So, okay, I'll give them that. So Dalton as a protagonist, as a main character, broadly I think he is one of the better aspects of the movie. He works well, and you need that. You need a good, strong protagonist in an action movie because typically action movies don't have a lot of plot complexity to fall back on, so you do really need the audience to be invested in the protagonist's hero journey because that's most of what you're getting in that kind of story. I also thought that a lot of the secondary characters in the movie were done well. I liked Charlie, the precocious little girl that helps run the bookstore. I liked some of the bartenders. Some of the other secondary characters were interesting enough, memorable enough, like they did their jobs, and they provided him a good foil to bounce off of and sort of reveal different aspects of his character. The fact that you got Dalton interacting with Charlie really early on in Act 1, like basically the first person he talks to in the town as he gets off the bus is her, where like he could easily have been like, screw off, kid, I don't have time for you, and he tunes into her right away. He's interested in her, even though she's a bit quirky. He's kind to her, and that gives us as the audience a chance to get more attached to him because those are some positive traits. And she's a fun character. There's multiple other secondary characters who do a good job of being rooted in a clear identity without taking up too much screen time and splitting the attention of the story, and fulfill one of the primary functions of a good secondary character, which is to reveal more about the protagonist in different ways and help nuance or make their character more interesting. And that worked well also, I think, in the story. A third thing that I really liked that I would put under the positives column is some of the world building. And you might be like, world building? What are you talking about? It's in the Florida Keys. Well, sure, but all stories have world building, even if it's not a fantasy or a sci-fi story where the world is original. The writers are still making conscious choices about how they describe and present the world that you're being shown. And in this case, the world is this sleepy backwater Florida Keys town, which would be easy for that to be boring or generic. I think they do a nice job, largely through showing how the characters feel about the setting. Not just showing us a setting, but showing us why the characters care about the setting. And they do that really well. Like Frankie, the owner of the Roadhouse who hires him, they do a great job doing just enough exposition to show why she cares so much about this bar, why she's invested in it as an element of her identity, not just like, because it's my bar and it's tied into, her family and different things. And they do that with multiple other characters who develop this sense of that classic, it's a small town that has fallen on hard times, but there are people who love it and stay here anyway because of reasons that are personal to them. And that's appealing. I think that's a thing that a lot of us can understand or empathize with, or maybe even have some personal experience of, because we get that strongly. I think it does a nice job of developing, the setting as a character, which is not a given. I've seen plenty of action movies, especially where that does not happen. So they do that well here, and I will give them props for that, and it adds to the enjoyment of the story. Okay, but with those things out of the way, let's get into some of the negatives, because unfortunately, there definitely were some, I think, fairly significant negatives, again, from a storytelling perspective, things that could have been done better that would have led to a better outcome. The first of those is a problem that I would sum up as implication rather than well-grounded exposition. What I mean by that is there are obviously lots of places where the writers know what they mean by something, and so they kind of just gesture at it, or they flat out, they tell, don't show, but they don't do a good job of creating very specific scenes that really ground that idea or that moment of character development or character payoff. They gesture at it or they imply it, but they don't really show it to you in the moment. So some examples of that. One is an element of the character arc for Dalton's character. It is implied that he feels really guilty about injuring / maybe killing his friend / rival from his UFC days. They kind of drop those little moments, but the implication is that he kind of hates himself or is almost afraid of himself and the fact that he is so good at hurting people and he's uncomfortable with that. Again, it's implied, but it's never really shown or explored for effect. The perfect time to dig into that tension more thoroughly, there's two moments that would have been like, again, they kind of gestured at it, but they didn't really hit the nail on the head. One is the sort of date scene with his love interest. They get into a conversation and he's all like, "You don't want to know me, I'm bad news." Again, we as the audience are left to infer what he means by that, but there's no point where they could have added 5 or 6 lines of dialogue to that scene that would have done a much better job of flat out showing his own fear/discomfort with who he is and what he does and what he's good at. And then you have another character who can provide a perspective on that. Like, they don't really do that. They just kind of point at it and then they move on. So you're left to kind of infer that that's how he feels, but you're not shown it in a more grounded way. And then towards the end of the movie, after the bad guys, go a step too far and push him over the edge, and then he kind of goes full action hero mode. Again, the implication is that he has some kind of realization or resolution, but we're not, again, it's not really shown. It's quick and easy, and he goes from, "I'm going to get on a bus and leave because I'm afraid of what might happen, or I don't want to get in." Is it because he is afraid of himself? Is it because he just doesn't want to get involved? Like, there's mixed messages. And then when he switches over, he has some dialogue with some of the bad guys, like as he's beating them up / killing them. "Oh, you've pushed me too far." Like, it's kind of that Hulk thing of, "You won't like me when I'm angry." But the payoff of the thematic arc ultimately should have been a realization on his part that this thing that I have been afraid of and that I have used selfishly in the past, now I see that if I use it for the right reasons to protect these people that I've come to care about who can't protect themselves, then that's what I'm meant for. And like, this is sort of the virtuous cycle. Like, I am finding redemption in using my talents, even though in the past that's been a problem. Now I see how I can use it for good. But like, again, that's never said. It's not said or shown. It's just kind of like, okay, we've moved into the part where we're racing towards the climax now. And it's implied that he sort of has this realization, but it doesn't take much to go from implication to exposition. But there's several times throughout the story where they don't do that, which means that even though you as the audience, it's not that you can't follow what's going on, but you don't have the hard-hitting payoff, the impact that you could have from a story if those beats are really clearly highlighted and done well versus left vague or muddy. And because that happens multiple times throughout the story, it leads to it being kind of like, all right, that was fine. Not like, whoa, wow, I felt something, like I got something out of that, which is what you get when you really emphasize the beats of a character arc and a thematic arc instead of just gesturing at them. There's some other ways that happens. It's implied that he does this thing where he like mentors the other bouncers and starts to build a team culture. Again, because that's actually done more and done better in the original Roadhouse. In this movie, it's all sort of done in a quick montage. So again, it's like, there you go, he did it. There's no reason that, I think Billy, his name is, like the current bouncer, the young guy who's there, he didn't have to like Dalton. It would have been more interesting if you'd put some character conflict in there. If he was like, we don't need an outsider coming in to do this, like, I can handle it because he's got like some ego stuff going on. That would have made it more interesting. And then slowly through multiple scenes and interactions, Dalton kind of wins him over and they develop a camaraderie as he kind of gives him confidence and some training to do it. Like, that would have been way more satisfying, but instead it was, oh sure, I'll just listen to whatever you have to say. Oh, you said one thing? Great, I can defend myself against a guy with a knife. Now I'm all set. Like, it was too quick and easy. Again, they're sort of gesturing at this idea of a mentoring training relationship, but they don't really pay it off. And a few other examples, but that was one of the main critiques I had of the story as a whole. We're kind of showing you this thing and expecting you to just either buy it or fill in the gaps yourself rather than really investing the page time to do those things well. One of the other negatives I sort of had for the movie, there's a bit of a tonal mismatch. The movie starts off a little more lighthearted and goofy, and his interactions with the villains at that first phase had almost like a Ant-Man Marvel vibe, I think mainly because one of the main characters felt a lot like Michael Peña's character from that movie. I don't know if they were trying real hard to just crib that character, but whether they were trying to or not, they did. And so it gave it that feel, which is fine. Like, that was the tone that they established at the beginning of the movie. There's kind of two primary action tones. One is the Teflon, invincible superhero, everybody gets punched in the face 10 times in a row before they go down. Less, like, more saturated, less gritty version. And then there's the John Wick version where it's like more real, more raw, more brutal, more violent, and the costs or the stakes of violence are more realistic. You don't see, and you sort of need to pick which way you're going to go. And the movie started more one way and then gradually tried to shift more into a little bit grittier or more serious action vibe, and then towards some of the elements in the climax bounced way back out into like, okay, that's ridiculous. He just like did this whole thing and jumped off. What? Okay, you're going back into the tonal shifts were a little jarring, and you really shouldn't do that. You need to be more consistent. Once you establish a tone, you need to carry it through. It just doesn't. It's not very good storytelling, and it weakens it. So they definitely did a chunk of that throughout the movie. And the most extreme example of that is him getting stabbed when the guy, right in the first opening sequence, when he's doing the underground fight scene and Frankie finds him to go hire him, and then the guy that's mad at him comes out and he's like, screw you, and full on stabs him with, like, in the movie, it's a good 4-inch blade, just like buries it in his side. And his reaction is like irritation. And then he walks over to his truck, pulls the knife out, and uses some duct tape. Like, that is too much. Because we all know what should happen if someone gets a 4-inch knife stuck in their abdomen. Like, that is not like you pull it out and you put duct tape on it and it's not even bleeding. Like, that is too much lack of realism, unless somehow you are building your entire rule set around that in a way that we can see and believe, but we're not, because there's plenty of other much more it's meant to be more grounded, except when it isn't for the sake of a scene. And that just doesn't work. And it also, weirdly enough, it really lowers the stakes. When you show us, especially in an action story, that your protagonist is functionally invulnerable, it makes it a lot harder to be worried about him, to feel like there's stakes when he is being fought, and like whatever. And then when the fact that, like, then when you have an antagonist who is kicking his ass, you're like, why now? Like, why all of a sudden this guy can beat him up and actually make him bleed? The other guy stabbed him with a friggin' knife and he was fine. Like, it undercuts a lot of the tension of the story in exactly the area where you want to have tension in an action story, because you're going to spend so much time watching those kinds of sequences play out. Yeah, some of that really needed an editorial pass to go, okay, wait a minute. I get what you were going for in this scene, but we need to do it differently because that's too much. And no one did that, so it made it into the final movie. Unfortunate. Speaking of the fight scenes, this is one of my other critiques. And this, you could almost call this a bit of an aside, because it's not technically a story critique, it's more of a filmmaking critique, but the action scenes weren't great. The low-level ones were actually really fun. Like when he took down the biker gang the first time, that was great. It was fun, it was punchy, the cinematography worked, but especially the big final fight scene and more as you went, there were a lot of these really swoopy camera motions, and really it moved too fast, so the action didn't serve as a narrative element. They really needed to do that better. And it does matter, because it's sort of like it is the main fun and games of this genre. So people like me who are huge fans of this genre, I was disappointed. And you've got Conor McGregor, like Jake Gyllenhaal obviously put in a lot of work, and you could see little moments where they were doing good, clean techniques. I kind of feel like if you had just given us a straight to camera shot of their acting in those scenes, it would have been better than what we got. So, when the action sequences in an action movie don't really work well or aren't very satisfying, like, that's a bit of a knock, because that's like what you're there for. It's like bad dialogue in a romance. Like, that's kind of what we're here for, is really witty, cool dialogue between interesting characters. If you've got flat characters saying boring stuff, that's not great for a romance. Kind of the same deal for an action movie. So as we wrap up and I kind of give my summary, I want to go back to what I said at the beginning, which is that I think it's important to try to evaluate a story based on how well it succeeds at doing what it is trying to do, not what you might wish it could have done. Like, I'm not going to knock Roadhouse for being a little bit more of a lighthearted and more straightforward action movie as opposed to like the next entry in the John Wick franchise, because it wasn't trying to be that. So even if that might have been what I would have preferred, it wasn't trying to be it. So, okay. But what it was trying to be was a satisfying, fast-paced, kind of a throwback to the 80s style bubblegum action hero story. And I would give it like a B- in how well it did that. It was fine, but there were a couple of elements of just basic core storytelling technique and tactics that would have made what it did work a lot better than it worked. So it's a fun movie. I certainly don't regret my time watching it, and if you're into that kind of thing, if that's sort of your home base, you'll have fun with it. I doubt I will go back and watch it again, whereas there are multiple movies of that similar style or intention or books that I would happily go back and watch again. I don't really think this is one of them, but I enjoyed it well enough that when it was done, I was like, okay, fair enough. I don't regret that I just did that, but solidly average. So take that as you will. I hope you found this review fun, interesting, informative. If you did, please don't forget to leave a like on the video. Drop a comment. What did you think about Roadhouse? If you've seen it, do you agree with my take on it, or do you have a different perspective? I would love to hear from you. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more in-depth analysis of popular books and movies and storytelling, craft and tactics and publishing discussions every week.